Everyone, welcome back to Crossroads. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Alyssa Adams, a research scientist at Cross Labs, and I will be your host. This Crossroads series is run by Cross Labs, a research institute in Kyoto, Japan. We are supported by Cross Compass, one of the leading AI companies in Japan. The overall goal of Cross Labs is to understand the mind through computational research. We explore ideas about the brain, AI, information science, artificial life, changes in society, open-endedness, and all sorts of other cool topics. Every month at Crossroads, we talk about intelligence and what parts of the sciences can help us understand a little bit more about what intelligence is, how it's a part of the world, and how living systems might be intelligent and how we can create them from scratch. The cross and crossroads refers to the bridge between many different disciplines in AI and A life, as well as industry and academia, because it takes a lot of different perspectives to tackle these big questions. So this is our monthly fun forum where we invite really cool and exciting speakers from a wide variety of backgrounds to share their research and to have an exciting discussion on these topics. So as always, today will happen in two parts. First, our guest speaker will give a wonderful talk followed by a Q&A session from the live audience. And then after that, we will transition the discussion from YouTube to Google Meet. We will post the Google Meet link for the discussion afterwards later, so feel free to join us there. And for the Q&A, we have a Slido link that we'll share in the YouTube live chat so people can use to ask questions, or you can simply post your questions in the YouTube chat. So now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Hector Zenil. Hello, Hector.
Hi, Alyssa. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I want to thank you and Olaf for the kind invitation.
Of course, absolutely. And I also wanted to share with the audience just how accomplished you are. We're really excited that you're here with us today. So for everybody in the audience who was watching, Hector Zenil has been involved in so many different things, and currently he's an associate professor and senior lecturer at King's College London at the School of Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Sciences. He's also an advisor at Bridge AI Innovate UK Bridge AI Innovate UK. He's also the founder and director of Oxford Immune Algorithmics and an elected member of the London Mathematical Society, a fellow of the British Royal Society of Medicine, board of trustee of the British Society for Research Aging. He's also published a couple of books. I think you have two books, one on the methods and applications of algorithmic complexity and algorithmic information dynamics.
I have them here.
Perfect. Yes, they're fantastic books. If you should absolutely read it. And he's also introduced the field of algorithmic information dynamics. And there's a really great video in Nature that you should also check out. So, and also as a personal note, I was telling him earlier, every time I look at his Google Scholar, there's always 10 more papers. It's an impressive amount. He has published over 130 papers in high impact journals. So anyways, we're very excited that you're able to join us and able to share these ideas with us. And I don't want to take any more time from the audience because we're all very excited to see your talk and all of the very exciting ideas that you have about talking to aliens.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. So I'm going to be talking about biosignatures and the complexity of living systems within the context of universal communication, because there's going to be another workshop later on organized by Cross Labs as well. And I'm going to be talking about what I think are fundamental laws of computation and information. And you can see on the screen basically 4 of these fundamental equations, and all of them are deeply related. For the 3 last ones constitute what is known as algorithmic information theory. And the first equation is most of you may be familiar with is Shannon entropy, which is based on the principles of classical probability and traditional statistics. And it was the basis also for statistical mechanics behind things like quantum mechanics. It is in some way, I call it very descriptive, because it doesn't tell you, for example, how to calculate the mass probability distribution of an object. So if you think of objects like the mathematical constant pi, for example, it looks very random, but it is completely deterministic. So some people that study Shannon entropy may find it odd to talk about the Shannon entropy of the digits of pi, but it is equally odd to talk about the entropy of tossing a coin, for example, because there's nothing not deterministic in tossing a coin. So from the initial conditions, the laws of physics basically determine what is the output of tossing a coin. But it is the classical example in entropy, and we always talk about the entropy of this stochastic process, even when it is completely deterministic. So the point is that it is very epistemological. The problem is that we don't have access to the generating mechanism, even when in both cases we know that it is deterministic. So I'm going to be using some examples like pi and other strings to show the case of these different measures. And then we have the other measures that basically come from, as Gregory Chaitin, one of the founders of the area, would say, is combining Shannon entropy with computation and mix it up in a blender. And basically you have algorithmic information theory. So basically it's incorporating the new theory of algorithms that was introduced in the 60s, or before, if you take Alan Turing, of course, and Shannon himself, and then you combine it with the principles of information theory, and what you get is what is called algorithmic information theory. That I'm going to try to convince you that is very fundamental for many aspects. So many of these indexes that have been proposed before serve different purposes. So we have, for example, classical probability telling how likely an object may be. We have entropy that may tell you how diverse an object may be. Algorithmic probability tells you how algorithmically likely something is, as opposed to how statistically likely it is. In other words, by tossing computer programs, how likely is that one of those computer programs actually produced the object that you are observing, as opposed to the statistical question in classical probability. Then you have Kolmogorov complexity, or algorithmic complexity, which tells you how algorithmic random an object is, and so on. Logical depth is another very interesting measure, how difficult the number of operations to build an object is, and so on. But all these measures are basically related to each other in some sometimes trivial and sometimes deep ways, depending on how you see it, if it is from the ontological or empirical point of view. So for example, things or objects that may have low Shannon entropy would have low Kolmogorov complexity for sure. But the other way around is not always the case. Something that has high Shannon entropy, which basically tells you that looks random or pseudo-random, is not really random according to algorithmic complexity, because there's a generating mechanism that is able to produce that object. And actually the generating mechanism is smaller in comparison to the object itself. And so on. All these measures is very interesting to see how they are related to each other, because obviously we have been researching these measures for about 80 years now. And there's a lot of understanding about them, how far we can go with each of them, what are the limitations, challenges, and so on. And also each measure of this on the screen and every other measure basically has some sort of different degree of difficulty. And some of my collaborators and I came up with kind of a term for that, because it's kind of some sort of phobia in the academic community. We call it the horror of uncomputability. And for over 60 years, or basically the story of the history of science, we have been favoring computable methods. So that's why you will see that in most of the studies, for example, the first thing they would do would be to take a method that is of statistical nature, we have a tendency to pick like Shannon entropy because it is very simple to apply. It is computable. We get the results very quickly and so on. It has been used and sometimes abused, for example, using statistical compression, which is deeply related to Shannon entropy as an approximation to algorithmic complexity, also because it is computable. And then we have other functions that are also complexity functions that are uncomputable in different ways. So the Rado-BCB functions, for example, which is related to the number of steps of computed programs, is upper semi-computable, which basically means that you can approximate it from above and others from below and so on. And some indexes are even completely uncomputable. So in principle, you cannot even approximate it, but you can still use it as inspiration of motivation for a complexity measure like Bennett's logical depth, which technically is uncomputable because you have both upper and lower semi-computability. However, this shouldn't be a problem to actually apply it in the real world. So many areas of science are likely uncomputable, and we know for certain, for example, that in mathematics we face and work in undecidable areas from algebra and category theory to calculus and topology. So simply because something is undecidable, which means it is in some fundamental way uncomputable, doesn't mean that you just drop the whole theory up to the leader bin. If that were the case, we wouldn't be doing algebra, calculus, topology, or anything else. And actually, there are few areas in mathematics that are not undecidable, so decidable in other words. And those include, for example, the Euclidean and Cartesian geometry, which basically means that you always have like a mechanistic way to derive every possible theorem in that theory. But they are also mathematically closed. That means that they are no longer very interesting. That's why you don't have the research departments doing Euclidean geometry or Cartesian geometry, because basically they are already finished pretty much. And they're still interesting, but we just learn them at school. There's no much research on them. So undecidability and uncomputability is actually something positive, a positive feature, because it allows open-endedness. And actually, we have done some research on this and proposed a definition of open-ended evolution based on this idea. As long as you have something that is computable, basically, in some fundamental way means that it is kind of closed and no longer very interesting. So one other point that I've been doing for the last decade or more is that actually algorithmic information theory is fundamental to understand causation or causality. And by that, I mean really causality in the physical sense and what causes something else, and not in the statistical way in which it has been introduced with things like, for example, the do calculus from Judy Apparel, which definitely have been very interesting and methods that have moved the theory of causality further from simply correlation, but it is still very limited. It is still based on classical statistics. But with algorithmic information theory, we can even go beyond because we know that it has a fundamental nature. So before I was talking about the digits of pi, and what you can see on the screen are the binary digits of pi. And you have also another sequence that is called the Q-Morse sequence that some of you may be familiar with. Basically, you start with a 0, and then you binary negate the 0, and the next digit is a 1. And then you take the first 2 digits, the first segment, and negate them again, so you have a 1, 0. And then you keep doing it, and basically you get this sequence. This sequence is very interesting because it is very easy to see that there's no subsequences that have a greater repetition than any other. In other words, all the subsequences are repeated the same number of times. And that means that this number is oral normal. And that also means that it is maximal entropy, because this is also an infinite sequence. However, I just told you the generating mechanism, which is very simple. And that basically means that many of these statistical measures are going to fail at finding the generating mechanism by just looking at the statistical regularities of these sequences. The same with pi. Pi has been also proven Borel normal in some bases, and looks for all purposes random. But again, it comes from a generating mechanism. And if you were applying Shannon entropy to these sequences, it wouldn't tell you anything about the algorithmic nature of this. But you can kind of solve this problem with the introduction of algorithmic complexity, which basically gives you an idea of how you can find for the generating mechanism. And this is based on the concept of an algorithm. So usually algorithmic complexity is defined in terms of Turing machines, but that has led to a lot of misunderstanding, people thinking that you require a Turing machine with a tape and a head printing symbols on the tape in order to define algorithmic complexity, but that is wrong. The concept of Turing machine came about as a formalization of the concept of algorithm, of what we could do on paper or on a computer. So this applies to anything that we think it is computable, or anything that you don't think it is like kind of magic or goes beyond the power of digital computers, then algorithmic complexity is relevant. And it is not only relevant in this way, but it is also relevant because in the 60s, many mathematicians were trying to characterize the concept of randomness in general. And there were at least 3 or 4 independent ways to characterize it. And it was also proven that each of them were equivalent with each other. And when that happens in mathematics, basically it means that you have captured something very fundamental. So this is not just any other measure of complexity. Basically, this is the measure of randomness, ultimate randomness. And it applies to anything, not only Turing machines and computer programs. It applies to mathematical functions, rewriting rules, anything. So this is an example of how you evaluate algorithmic complexity. And for the string of repeating 0101, you can easily find the computer program. And actually, in some cases, you can prove that it is the shortest one. So semi-computable or even non-computable doesn't mean that you can find actual cases in which we can decide whether it is the shortest program or not. It only means that in general, you cannot do it or come up with an algorithm that gives you the answer. But actually, you also don't have to care about finding the shortest computer program. In most science, we are perfectly fine by just finding better approximations to certain models. And this is the case that I've been also doing for at least 10 years, that actually algorithmic information theory gives you the means and the framework to find the generating mechanisms behind an object or a phenomenon. And again, S, when evaluating algorithmic complexity, it doesn't have to be a binary string. It can be any object that has a computable representation. It can be a network, it can be a tensor, it can be an image, which at the end is a matrix. It can be a video, it can be literally anything that you are able to write down on paper or on a computer as some sort of representation. And if you don't care about the minimal program, basically what you are able to do is to find shorter explanations that can explain your original data. So in some fundamental way, Kolmogorov complexity rules all other complexity indexes. And that doesn't mean that you cannot come with new ones. But if you come with new ones, you have to know where you place it. And in general, we have like 2 very general complexity indexes that cover pretty much all of them, or basically frame all others, which is Shannon entropy and Kolmogorov complexity. And you can see on the screen, for example, how each of these indexes relates to each other. This is a whole area, in my opinion, an area that hasn't been explored enough. And there are many open questions, but in general, you can come up with this kind of table of relationships between them. And I was telling you before, for example, it depends on how you see the problem as ontological or epistemological, because Shannon entropy actually can be equal to Kolmogorov complexity if you have access to the mass probability distribution. The problem is that Shannon entropy doesn't give you the means. Again, it is the example I was giving you before with the digits of pi. If you knew that the digits that you were looking at come from the generating mechanism that generates pi in the first place, you know that it's completely deterministic and you will be able to predict the next digit. The problem is that you don't know that it comes from that deterministic mechanism. So in your probability distribution, you just have all the sequences that resemble the digits of pi instead of having the algorithm that produces pi in the first place, which would be unique in your probability distribution, basically would tell you that pi was deterministic in the first place. And that's why Shannon entropy could, in principle, is actually the same as Kolmogorov complexity, but in practice is completely different. In practice, you don't have access and the means to have access to those probability distributions, so usually is much weaker than Kolmogorov complexity. But there are many very interesting relationships between all these indexes. And they have been, some of them have been very successful. So compressibility that is meant to approximate algorithmic complexity, but usually is more related to Shannon entropy because we use popular statistical compressors like LempFSIF, have produced very interesting results. So this comes from a landmark paper by Cilibrasi and Vitani entitled Clustering by Compression that came out in 2005. And they show that they could reconstruct a full phylogenetic tree from mammal genomes. And the correspondence with what we know in biology is perfect. And that in principle looks very impressive. But it also has some faults. And the fault is that this is actually a very trivial problem in evolutionary biology. And usually this is called a GC content challenge. So it has been known that two genomes that are related to each other would have about the same number of G and C amino acids. So basically by just a counting argument, just counting GCs straight away, you can reconstruct this tree in an evening. And obviously this can come as a surprise to some people not familiar with evolutionary biology. And there was no comparison in this paper to reconstructing this tree by those means, for example. But still, it is very interesting because it means that just by a compression algorithm, you can basically reproduce the same results, and it is conforming with the expectation. And we have applied several indexes of algorithmic information also to other more challenging problems. The problem of nucleosome occupancy, for example, in DNA sequences, which is believed to be the second most greatest challenge after protein folding in molecular biology. And that's because when you fold all these DNA in what is called nucleosomes, depending on which parts are closer to each other, they regulate genes in different ways. So a lot of genetic regulation comes from this structural complexity within the DNA. And what we did in this paper was to show that actually without training, we could not only match, but sometimes even go beyond current state of art algorithms, which is something we always do in our papers. We always compare with the best state-of-the-art algorithm around. In this case, for example, is the Kaplan model. We don't compare with just a random process, for example, or some sort of restricted version of Shannon entropy and so on. So here's another very interesting example of how Shannon entropy and even statistical compression can fail at characterizing fundamental properties of an object. So we came up with this graph that we published in a paper in Physical Reviews E in 2017. And the graph is very interesting. Every time that you add a new node, basically you add the same number of edges than the new node label. So you start with a node, for example, and when you add another one, And this is original label 2, so it has 2 edges. So if you go to the number 3, this is missing 1, but in the next step, label number 3 actually gets 3 edges and so on. So what we built basically is a graph whose degree sequence has maximal entropy on purpose, but the adjacency matrix looks very simple with very low channel entropy. Both descriptions can reconstruct the object in full. So they are lossless, but they are basically giving you contradictory results. If you apply channel entropy to the degree sequence, you are going to say that this graph is maximal entropy or approximates in the limit maximal entropy. But when you look and apply channel entropy to the adjacency matrix, it doesn't look anything random. And this is basically because the theory of classical information lacks of what is called an invariance theorem. And the invariance theorem in algorithmic complexity basically tells you that it is quite independent from the choice of computer language. So remember, I was telling you that you can pick either a universal Turing machine or a complete computer language, or any other rule system that it is Turing complete, which, by the way, it is very easy to produce. You can have just a set of small rules, and that basically would become Turing complete and would be suitable for the definition of algorithmic complexity. But what the invariance theorem tells you is that if you change your computer language or Turing machine, basically the result is going to approximate the result of picking any other algorithm or Turing machine. So they converge. So it is quite independent. So in this case, for example, if I were applying algorithmic complexity to these two objects, eventually they would converge to the limit. Whereas channel entropy and compression based on channel entropy would fail at converging. So the question is, can we do better than channel entropy in practice? Because many people obviously have come up with the argument that maybe algorithmic complexity is very fundamental, but can you actually apply it in practice? And there is a way, actually, and it is a beautiful result called algorithmic probability and decoding theorem, which came from the founders of algorithmic information theory, including Chaitin with his omega number, but also more specifically Ray Solomonoff that you see on the screen, and he was one of the participants of this famous Dartmouth summer workshop on AI, where the AI concept was and name was coined for the first time, alongside Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, and John McCarthy and others. And Solomonoff came up with this idea of algorithmic probability, which I'm going to explain you with this diagram. So imagine you have some sort of monkey typing on a typewriter, and you want to calculate the probability of that process to generate something with structure, let's say the digits of pi again. So if you do it digit by digit, the probability of getting it right diminishes exponentially. Right? But what if you change the question, and instead of a monkey writing on a typewriter, you replace the typewriter by a computer? And now every keystroke is actually a piece of a computer program. Then things change dramatically, because what you have to produce are not the digits of pi one by one, but actually a formula or a program that generates the digits of pi. And because pi comes from a short generating mechanism, the algorithmic probability of producing pi is very high because it has a short description. So you see how beautiful this is, because it's basically connecting many areas. It is connecting classical probability theory with computation. And this is the formula that gives you basically the algorithmic probability of anything, which is very similar to classical probability, but instead of having, for example, a number of digits, here is an exponent. What you have is the size of the computer program that produces that object. And then you have another beautiful result that basically connects algorithmic probability with algorithmic complexity. and they are inversely related to each other. So basically something that has high algorithmic probability has low Kolmogorov complexity and the other way around. So again, this is very fundamental. This is not related only to Turing machines. This is not only related to bit strings. This is related to everything. And it's so fundamental that actually Marvin Minsky, at the end of his life, said that this was the most important result after Gödel's theorems. And he suggested he would have liked to spend his life actually doing research in this area. And very recently, the area also got a lot of attraction and attention because the chief scientist of OpenAI came out in a talk that he gave somewhere in Silicon Valley, saying how fundamental this was for AI and how related it is to the current trends in, for example, coding transformers, which in some way are kind of compressors. So one way in which we also solved and approached this problem was to explore the space of all possible computer programs. So you can enumerate computer programs and explore a corner of the space. And then once you find a computer program that explains a piece of data, you store that computer program and go for the next piece of data that you want to explain and put it into a sequence. And what we have found is actually we are able to characterize better some of these objects. And actually we can come up with a causal explanation that has a graphical representation. And these are very common. These are state space diagrams where you have an explanation for your piece of data. And you don't only have one, but actually we explore trillions of small computer programs that generate a set of computable models explaining the data. And you may think, oh, but maybe this is only related to Turing universal systems. And again, this has nothing to do specifically or explicitly with Turing machines, but with computation algorithms, mathematical functions, rules, and anything else. But you may think that this is probably just related to universal computation. And this is a question that we asked ourselves in this paper. And it turns out that it doesn't, because when you use sub-universal models, according to the Chomsky hierarchy, you still see this behavior. So we ranked the output distribution of a very large set of computer programs and compared the distribution, which is an approximation to algorithmic probability, to other models of computations that also produce distribution based on the output. So we ranked them and we compared them. We found out that we could explain the bias towards simplicity using the same arguments. Basically, this means that this is not only related to universal models of computation, which do have the greatest bias explained by algorithmic probability, but you can still explain most of the simplicity bias in sub-universal systems, above 50%, except when you take, for example, Shannon entropy. With Shannon entropy doesn't give you enough power to explain the distribution of the output of these models, but as soon as you start using algorithmic information, you can explain most of the behavior. Sorry for the typo there. It should say a computable greedy divide and conquer algorithm that we call the block decomposition method. So this method basically combines the best of Shannon entropy that we cannot completely get rid of and algorithmic information theory. So what we came up with is this measure that looks for local estimations of algorithmic complexity. That is, the small computer programs that can explain pieces of data, but also approximates Shannon entropy rate in the long term globally. And we combine both measures to basically say something interesting about the object, something that we couldn't say with Shannon entropy alone, for example, or with what we call the coding theorem method, which is just to find these small computer programs that explain different pieces of the data, because that's computationally very expensive, right? So we can only explain small pieces of data, and that's why it is local approximations of algorithmic information. But by the way, even when it is computationally very expensive, what you do is to create a database, which is quite large, but it's still manageable, explaining your small pieces of data. So you don't have to recalculate everything again every time that you want to evaluate an object. And what we found is actually that our measures conform with the expectation of the distribution. So you would see this kind of picture in any classical probability and Shannon entropy textbook, where you have Bernoulli, no, is it Bernoulli or Poisson? I think it's Bernoulli distribution. So basically, you are plotting all possible entropy values of all possible strings of certain size, and the distribution looks like this one: the blue and the green. So green is entropy, and then we applied compression to that set of same binary strings up to certain size, and then you get this other distribution, and you can see how a statistical compression, in this case, Lemped-Ziff, looks exactly the same as entropy, because and this is not a surprise, these compression algorithms are based on Shannon entropy. But then when you apply BDM on the same set of strings, what you get is an approximation of a long tail distribution, which is compatible and conforms with the theoretical expectation of algorithmic probability. So in other words, we can find strings that would have high entropy, but would have lower algorithmic complexity. And here are two examples, for example. So this opens up another dimension of what we can do with Shannon entropy. It's basically giving you the depth of what you can say about the generating mechanism behind all these objects. And again, this applies to anything. It's not only bit strings. We have applied it to networks and genetic regulatory networks and so on. So this is why I think computation and algorithmic information theory is very deeply related to ultimate causality. And that's because what you want in science is to find the generating model, an explanation that explains the output of some phenomenon. In this case, we have a cellular automaton. This is rule 30. And usually a common observer would have only partial access to the output. And without output, the work of science is basically to try to reverse and infer the model that explains the output. And this is basically what we are trying to do. We have applied this to many applications, and I'm going to be able to cover maybe 2 or 3, but this is a very well-known one. It's an experiment with blood ants that was suggested by Rednikova in the 60s, I believe, but then she came back doing more experiments in the 90s. And this example is included in the famous book by Lee and Vitani called More of Complexity and Its Applications. But even when in their book, they apply lossless compression, in particular Lemped-Ziff, to many other areas, they weren't able to apply it in this one because this involves very short binary strings. And let me explain you briefly what the experiment was about. So they have ants and food placed in some sort of maze, and they release the ants, the foragers, and they have to come back and tell the other ants where the food is. And they do all sorts of control experiments to replace, for example, the pathways to make sure that there's no pheromones on the path and so on, so that they make sure that the ants that get to the food in the next cycle only were able to do so because they got information from the first set of ants. So they make sure that they are communicating with each other and communicating these instructions. And what they did was, for example, to change the position of that food, sometimes in very simple places where you have very simple instructions like go left all the time and you will find food. And you would expect that those instructions take less time to be communicated to the next foragers. And when you place food in more complex positions, locations, it would take longer to communicate between ants. And that was the case. They were able to quantify the communication time, but they were not able to quantify the complexity of where the food was located. So when you wanted to apply compression or Shannon entropy, you would get like a flat line, which basically you are seeing it here. So Shannon entropy, it actually looks even reversed as it was not conforming with expectation. The same with BZIP2, which is based on Lempezif. But then when you use the algorithms that we have been proposing, you get exactly the kind of curve shape that the researchers were expecting, and that's because we were able to apply algorithmic complexity to very short strings. So not only we went beyond statistical compression, but actually also solves a huge problem that was the difficulty of applying any measure to very short strings. This is another experiment we did with humans. We recruited 3,500 people ranging from the age of 7 to 80 years old. And we asked them 5 questions to produce what they thought would look random and to place objects in random configurations. And obviously, I cannot get into much of the details, but we were able to reconstruct what is known in cognitive science, where people basically produce or have the greatest cognitive abilities at around the age of 25. And when you try to reproduce these results, because again, we always test against other indexes in their best shape, like Shannon, not only Shannon entropy for a special case, but Shannon entropy rate and the best possible definition of Shannon entropy for this experiment. We tested against Shannon entropy, against compression algorithms, and even other algorithms used in psychometrics. And the only one that reproduced this shape and had any meaning and actually had reproduced the same curve across all the 5 experiments was the block decomposition method. And again, the block decomposition method, as the name suggests, is basically looking for blocks, not only that repeat across the string or the object, but also blocks that has some causal meaning according to algorithmic complexity and are also repeated in that object. And we also went beyond. We combined this idea of the block decomposition method with perturbation analysis, which, as you may know, comes from all these do calculus ideas from Julia Pearl. So you perturb your data, and then you try to explain what happened and compare with the previous model. And that's exactly what we do, but in software space. So what we do is we have a piece of data, we perform some change in the data, original data, and then we see how that change impacted the original computable explanation. And you can see what happens. So if you have a random object, for example, and if you do any random perturbation, the program that explains that object and the original program that explained the object before the perturbation looks about the same size. So that tells you not only about the perturbation, but also the nature of the original object. And that is very different. For example, if you have a very simple piece of data and then the perturbation happened to have a great impact, the original explanation, computable explanation, would dramatically change, right? Because before it was just print once all the time, but suddenly you have like a 0 and a random position, and you have to add it to the original program to explain the new data. And basically the difference of that data tells you the nature of the perturbation and the nature of the original data. And you can also apply this to all sorts of objects, including networks. And with networks, for example, we know the algorithmic complexity of a simple network, like a complete network, grows by the logarithm of the number of nodes, right? Because every time that you add a node, you basically just connect it to everything else. And that's the simplest explanation of the new graph compared to the old one. You can just describe it as a complete graph, and then you give the number of nodes of the new complete graph. So it grows as a logarithm of the number of nodes. But when it comes to a random graph, it grows by the number of edges, because every edge that you provide, you have to give the exact connections to the other edges. So we have the two extremes, and basically anything in between, all the perturbations that you can do to apply to networks comes in between. And basically you can do those perturbations in sequence, and you get what we call information signatures, that they can characterize all these networks in a very precise way. So let me come back to kind of the first question, and my case. So I think compression, and I'm not talking about statistical compression, but compression in the way of algorithmic complexity, is comprehension in a very strong way. And here is missing something. It should say teleology of science, because science, what we want to do in science is to find models which are usually short explanations compared to the data they explain. And that's kind of the direction and goal of science. That's one way to see how science has developed over time. And you can see here some examples that I give in this paper of how over time we have replaced what we thought was random phenomena by non-random models that capture and can explain more random phenomena than we could explain before. And that has happened with, for example, the movement of stars and planets on the sky. And for example, in the time of Aristotle, the explanation for why objects would fall to the floor was related to, the explanation was to say that objects loved to be attached to the floor. That was back then the explanation. Nobody would have thought that actually what kept planets on their orbits and stars and everything else was related in any way to how objects on Earth are attached to the floor or fall to the floor. So we created a new model that basically explains what not only looked random before, but actually merged phenomena that couldn't be thought to be related in any way into a single model. And we have been doing this for the whole history of science, trying to explain what appears random in the first place with a short model, shorter than the data itself, and merging all these models over time. Another way to see it also is that we have some sort of science is some sort of computable simulation that comes with computable models from initial conditions, and the output is basically to try to predict that phenomena that appear random to us before. So the question of how can we distinguish life from non-life and techno and biosignatures? And here on the screen you have two pictures that I took in Northern Ireland and Scotland. One is of basal columns, and the other one is what is called a fairy ring, which are mushrooms that grow from the center to the outside the center, and they start forming some sort of a circle. That is not perfect, but it's still a circle made by nature. And this one has to do with life. It is mushrooms producing this kind of pattern. But this one doesn't. So these one are almost exact copies, at least if you see them as pentagon columns. These are identical to each other in some rough way, but they are absolutely not related to any life process whatsoever. It came from the interaction between hot lava and the cooling process of sea water coming onto them. So most of these basal columns are found in places where there was volcanic activity and cold water interacting with each other, and basically you form these kind of perfect blocks that repeat over a space. So there have been some proposals, for example, to look at life as the abundance of repeating blocks, and this will be a perfect example of how that kind of measure would have, or find it very challenging to characterize life in such a way. And what we've been saying is that there's no way to characterize life without taking into account the context. And when it comes to causality, it is not a surprise that objects haven't ever been considered as isolated data points. Not only in evolutionary biology, this is not true, but also in complexity science, we have been always interested in how you explain data. And by explaining, it means you have a causal explanation that you can run and produce some sort of prediction of why the data was constructed in that way. So before I get to some sort of example of how we can apply this to bio and techno signatures, we have applied these concepts to many applications, including, for example, cellular automata to characterize Wolfram classes. We have been able to do so with high statistical significance. And also in 2018, we were able to separate organic from non-organic molecules, and we reported it in this paper by looking at almost any representation of the chemical data, and not only nomenclature like smiles and inky, but also molecular distance matrices, connectivity, bond connectivity, distance matrices of chemical networks. We show that actually with any of these kind of chemical data, applying compression and our own measures, we could separate the data, and our measures were slightly better than the other ones, but basically not by much. And while it is still a very interesting result, we could do it in any available data. More recently, there was also some spectral data that was made available in a paper, and we also gave it to our algorithms and also to compression algorithms, and we were able to separate in the same way the data that we reported in 2018. So with these algorithms and methods, basically you can tell apart some of these cases I was talking about, where Shannon entropy wouldn't be able to characterize the object, but you would be able to characterize it by algorithmic complexity, and not only characterize it, but come up with a state diagram that tells you exactly how that object may have been constructed, and not only one, but actually a set of possible reconstructions of that object from which you can pick the simplest one, the shortest one, and so on. For this, we have been calculating a lot of data, and we have been given some grants to continue computing it, and we can keep improving the results by enlarging the data set I was talking about before. So one other application that we published in 2012 was based on the concept of Bennett's logical depth. And that is another beautiful concept from algorithmic information theory, because one of the concerns of algorithmic complexity is that basically it's giving you mostly like two extreme cases. Either something is very simple or something looks random, and sometimes we are interested in what lies behind. So there's the structure in some other words. So what we did was to look at the compression time, so number of steps from a compressed object version. And we did this by running it on a virtual machine, because in practice, this is very difficult in a digital computer. So if you want to control the decompression time, computers are always running like batch processes behind, so it is very difficult to control. So what you do is to set up a virtual machine and basically control for everything. And we were able to classify all these images that capture different things in a very interesting way. So the first picture is showing you the ranking by algorithmic complexity alone, using our methods. So you have, for example, very simple ones at the bottom, like a monochromatic image or repeating images at the bottom, and then random looking ones at the top. So this is white noise, this is cellular automaton rule 30, and it's negation, and so on. And you see it is indeed in the middle where you can see some structure. some faces of people and some other objects like circuit boards. But when you look at the decompression time, you get exactly what you would expect from an approximation of Bennett's logical depth. So what you have at the bottom are exactly those simple and random cases. And that's because basically, if you have something that is very simple and you compress it, the decompression instructions are very simple, right? So it is very quick to decompress. And if you have something that is random, then you cannot compress it much. So also the decompression instructions are very short because you couldn't compress it much. So basically it's just like a print. So in both cases, you have very short decompression times, and that's why these objects, you send them to the bottom. But then basically means that those things that were compressed more and have less trivial decompression instructions take longer. And you can see that at the top, we got the circuit board, people's faces, some fractals generating complex behavior and so on. So this was a very interesting application published in 2012 in the Complexity Journal. This is how we mapped what algorithmic complexity was producing for this set of images, and how logical depth approximated by these means basically send them to. So very, very interesting application there. Here is another application to inverse problems. This is not logical depth. We go back to the block decomposition method. And what we have is cellular automata that we would scramble every row and feed it to the block decomposition method and come up with a reconstructed version. Just by taking the minimal algorithmic complexity, we were able to reconstruct this cellular automata, and maybe that is not very surprising, although it is a nice result. But if you scramble every row and then you ask the algorithm to infer the time, so basically give you the dynamical system and the generating mechanism, we were able to do so. So here what we did is to apply a perturbation to every possible row after scrambling them, and basically finding the configuration that has a shorter causal explanation. And you can see the reconstructions. And you can even see where the errors come from, because you see this one that is not completely reconstructed. And that's because the blocks that we take, for example, are 4 by 4. So every 4 rows, you have some sort of small error that can be fixable by just growing the calculation of the other method that basically looks for the short computer programs that can explain that piece of data. So even for cases that are very complex like this one, this was a very close approximation, as you can see. So that this is much more impressive than this other case. And this was published in iScience, which is a cell journal. And I think this was in 2018, if I remember correctly or so. So more recently, we have been applying some of these ideas to message reconstruction. And again, this is related to techno and biosignature detection. So you may remember the Arecibo message, for example, that was sent to space. It was sent as a unidimensional stream, radio stream, from the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico. And we expect the receivers to basically reconstruct that message in 2 dimensions, because these are supposed to be an image. So you see the original image here, but actually this was sent as a linear stream of bits. So we asked us the question of whether an alien will be able to reconstruct this information from the message itself, and turns out that actually it does. We found that data encodes its own geometry and topology. And what happens is you do some sort of perturbation analysis that we were doing before. So if you start with a one-dimensional object, you find that everything looks like random. And then you add another dimension and start playing with the dimensions, the proportion of the image. So the width and the length. And at some point, you get to the original intended message. And that's where the graph spikes down, showing that basically this configuration is the lowest algorithmic complexity one. And this is very fundamental, because it's kind of a very agnostic way to reconstruct the original message and give us some hope that actually by sending these messages around, aliens are going to be able to find out the original configuration, at least, if not meaning, but it will be the first step into trying to figure out the meaning. There is something also very interesting and fundamental here, because if you think about it, every one of these configurations has exactly the same algorithmic complexity, because the transformation between each other is of fixed size. But it is actually the approximation that gives us the difference and picks the right one. So we have another paper called Emergence and Algorithmic Information Dynamics of Systems and Observers, because this is basically an observer-based application of our algorithms, where actually the error gives you the right answer. And this can be applied to anything. So we got also three-dimensional images that we scrambled from medical cases, and we were able to reconstruct them. So these are two cases. So that's for the sender, but what about, sorry, for the receiver? So the receiver can decode the message, the dimensions, but what about the sender? So there's another problem of how can you send a message when you don't know what is the time and space frame of the receiver? That happens with plants on Earth, for example, or trees. We tend to believe that they don't move and they are very slow, but that's only because of the time scale. So, or take a fly, for example, that only lives a couple of days. Anything that happens for a fly happens very quickly. So how could we solve sending a message out there that is suitable for the time scale and space scale of the receiver? So we came up with this kind of cool idea of sending fractal messages. And in this other paper, we show how you can encode a message into a fractal, which basically means that you are repeating the message an infinite number of times in all possible scales, both temporal and spatial. So in this case, we used the Biosignatures function to encode the original message. And we gave an example of how you could encode, for example, saying hi. And a lot of stuff is coming out of this research. But obviously, we're running out of time. Actually, yeah, we took 1 hour. And back to where we're applying this to cell and molecular biology. This was an application of genetic regulatory networks where we are going to pick the genes that are fundamental to homeostatic processes and specialized processes. And we validated with 3 different genome browsers, gene ontology, KEGG pathways, and EcoSeq pathways. And we also were able to validate a cancer pathway in another paper published by the Royal Society, where actually we show that by introducing algorithmic probability bias into evolving objects, you would produce some sort of modular hierarchy. In other words, you start producing these repeating blocks and genetic memory, and that was in 2018. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank my collaborators on the screen, some resources there. I've done most of my research in these institutions, and I would strongly suggest you to watch this video that Nature, the journal, produced for us. We didn't ask them to produce it, but we published their paper, and they were excited about it and produced this video to explain how we are also using this kind of research in AI. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Wow, lots of amazing discoveries and amazing theorems and fantastic measures. And it's really, really cool to see how they're all related.
Yeah, thanks. So,
yeah, of course, it's super fun. So like, I'm gonna dive right into questions because I had one that I was dying to ask, and I'm really curious. Could you say a little bit more about the relationship between compressibility and causality? Because I know it came up a few times, but I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, there are 2 types of compressibility. Usually, colloquially, we use it in popular ways, and we mean statistical compression. So statistical compression is to correlation, what not statistical compression is to causation. So compression as it is today, and it is mostly applied, things like Lempel-Ziff are related to Shannon entropy and mostly correlation. They can still give you some idea of what could be the generating mechanism, but they are incredibly limited because they are in some way descriptive. They don't give you the actual mechanism. But actual compression is not a statistical compression. So you can compress in many ways, and one in particular is algorithmic compression. And that basically means what we mean in science. So you have a model, small model usually, that explains a large data set. And that's why I made the analogy of compression is comprehension, because that's basically what we mean in science. So we want to explain a phenomenon with a short explanation, a model.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, super cool. I'm also really curious. Does that, because I know you talked a lot about how it relates to the way that we describe a system as well, and it's sort of like, you know, the whole point of BDM is to approximate sort of like the best way, the smallest possible program to describe it. And I guess like for causality, does that also transfer over to the idea of you know, even though we can't get like the minimal smallest I guess explanation for something, does this idea also mean the same thing for understanding like what causes something, I guess like causality in a system?
That's a great question, because that's exactly some sort of confusion that by looking at the smallest program is perhaps not related in any deep way to causality. But what I'm saying is, let's forget about the minimal program. That the purpose of that definition is to prove theorems. But the value, I think, is the framework and the method behind. So it allows you to find explanations. And these explanations, it doesn't matter that it is computer programs. It could be anything else. So a mathematical function is also a program, as long as you can write it down. And that's what we always do. This time we write it on digital computers. So algorithmic complexity and the definition basically gives you the means to explore the space of possible explanations. And it is not only related to computer programs, it's related to anything. And let's forget about the minimal one. That's not even very interesting, and we already know that it's uncomputable. That only makes the problem interesting, because you can always find like a smaller one, which is exactly what happens in science. We have a model and looks good enough at that time, but then we have another one that explains even more things. So in proportion, is smaller than the previous one, because it can explain even more. And we keep doing it all the time. So we find other computer programs, because you can see models in science as computer programs as well. So the equations of Einstein or Newton or whatever you name it is basically a computer program. And actually it's literally a computer program, because the way we solve them is by numerical methods. We put them on computers. So this whole idea of computer programs are not very relevant, they are Turing machines and so on, has been misleading people for a long time.
That makes a lot of sense, I think. And also, do you think there's a relationship between, I guess, I would say the embodiment of an observer and their ability to compress something? And what I mean by that is, you know, we're very limited in our ability to sense the world. I mean, we have vision in a very small range of wavelengths in the EM spectrum. And you know, our hearing is not really that amazing, or maybe it is. You know, I don't really know much about hearing, but you know, the point is that we're really limited in how we can sense the world. So, have you looked at the relationship between the properties, I guess, like the embodiment of an observer, and that observer's ability to compress or to understand the causality of the world around them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we found fascinating in the example I was talking about with reconstructing the dimensions of a message, because all these messages in their different configurations have exactly the same algorithmic complexity, right? Because the only difference among them is how the configuration was between them, and that's just a small computer program that sends one configuration to the other one. and it is of fixed size because basically you just change the dimensions. So it is actually our inability and our limitations of how we approximate algorithmic complexity that allow us to pick the right configuration. And we wrote a whole paper about it because we found it fascinating how our inability to come up with the ultimate answer basically is the means to get to the answer in this case. And maybe it is not in all cases, but because you can always come up with better approximation and estimations, you always have the hope to improve your answer. And that's why we also related it to open-endedness and why we think computability is actually a good thing in any system.
Yeah, fascinating. I also just want to remind everybody that if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please do use the Slido, or you can just pop it right into the YouTube chat. So I'm going to hop over to the Slido because we have a few questions. And of course, I could ask 1,000 questions. I mean, there's so many things to ask and so many things to explore with this kind of work. So, but I want to give time to people in the audience. So Olaf asks on universal comprehension, as we better compress our world, how do we overcome issues of models not being lossless and Worfian limits of computing substrates?
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, it's also very related to how we have seen algorithmic complexity over time as a lossless method, where we can also have lossy methods. And one of them is, for example, the fractal behavior I was showing on the screen. So fractal compression, for example, is a lossy method. I think it is an unexplored question, and I wouldn't make it justice if I answer something silly. I would need to think about it, but it's a great question to explore more.
That's understandable. So I'll go to the next question. And this question asks, in Shannon, we are assuming both parties have the underlying knowledge to decompress. Can we compress without this common knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great point, and what I'm planning to cover in the next workshop on universal communication. And I think this idea came from Gregory Chaitin, that the best thing we can do is actually to send a compressed object, for example, of all human knowledge, for example, all the web. You compress it and send it to aliens. The problem is, how do they decompress it? So the idea was to send them the computer with instructions to decompress it. And in the paper I was talking about with fractal messaging, we are giving some ideas on how we could do that, basically send the carrier and the decompression instructions together with the message. And that's because we are using this mathematical function that encodes the message into the fractal. And when you unfold the mathematical function, basically you evaluate it, you get the message within the function. So it's like sending both things, the computer and the message. So it's also a fascinating idea. But I also agree that the two ends have to have something in common, because you always have the problem. Even using the computer, they would need to perhaps hit the enter button or something. So there has to be some commonality between the two ends to at least start any conversation.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense, and it certainly makes me wonder about our methods of I guess biosignature detection. I mean, even if it's about SETI kind of detection, makes me. So how would you say that would you say our technology is on track for being able to accomplish this, or do you think that we need to change our methods?
I think we need to change them, the way we approach it, at least, because I think the whole SETI conversation has been mostly about the syntax of how communication may happen. We always think about larger radio telescopes instead of what the message actually may carry. And we have all these examples in movies, and they are not very far away from what scientists actually think could be the message, where aliens send us, for example, the primes, the prime numbers. So they always send something like very mathematical and simple. But I don't think it's going to necessarily be the case. Even the prime numbers could be like almost arbitrary. And we have another paper about it with the Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences, and to try to explain whether mathematical sequences were really kind of independent from social biases from mathematicians themselves. And it turns out that they are not completely independent. So you see bias towards sequences that look interesting to humans in the encyclopedia of all sequences in the that is available online. So there's this kind of cloud between those two. The overall shape, you can explain it with algorithmic complexity, but then you have some overrepresentation of certain sequences that are only interesting to humans. So that means that aliens could have also their favorite sequences, and it could be primes or something else. We think primes are kind of fundamental because of their nature. You can basically build all other natural or integer numbers from primes. But it could be not the case, and I don't think it's going to be as simple as that. So I think we have to move towards the semantics of SETI, as I am calling it, from this research I've been doing. So I was kind of surprised when I came up with this idea, when we developed, and you were involved, Alisa, in that paper on message reconstruction. We thought this is kind of simple. Someone should have already done it before. And then we contacted SETI people because there was some coverage in the news about it, and they contacted the experts in SETI, no relation to me or anyone else. And they were kind of surprised. They said, yeah, this seems kind of the first agnostic approach of the semantics of what message could look like. Because obviously, if you want to understand the meaning of the message behind, you first have to reconstruct it in the original intention. So we still have the problem of what these images actually mean. So I think there's a human, and there's an antenna, and the planets on that famous Arecibo message, and we have no idea whether they are going to understand it. But at least if we want to have a chance, we have to reconstruct the original intention.
Exactly. And it kind of reminds me of why we chose base 10 for a lot of our like representing numbers. And a lot of that comes from the historical reason that we have 10, 10 digits on our hands. And if we had 12 digits on our hands, then, or a different number of digits on our hands, then our whole number system could be completely different, just simply because of the fact of that's an important number to us because of our experiences.
Absolutely, and Stephen Wolfram has some very interesting ideas in that regard. And at the summer school, Wolfram Summer School also often comes up what is the best number system base for certain arithmetic operations. And turns out it is not the optimal one, 10, and it is for sure that we picked it because of the number of fingers.
Oh, interesting. So does the optimal, I guess, like base, I guess, like what does it, like what's the optimal number for, or like base for something like, no, I don't know, like set theory, I don't know, like how does that change? I'm curious about that.
So that depends on how you define optimal for what purposes. So for example, for computers, the optimal is kind of a binary. And the cool thing is that we know that we can change the base and not lose any information. And again, that is given by algorithmic information theory. So that would basically tell you that you always preserve the information when you change your language, because you always have a computer program, a compiler that can compile between one and another language. So you are not losing any information. That's key. When it comes to optimality to some other things, for example, I know, and I think one of the outputs of some of those projects in the Wolfram Summer School has been that multiplying tables, for example, would be significantly simplified by taking other bases than 10. Because right now, for example, 10 is very useful for addition, but when it comes to multiplication, we kind of overcomplicate the operations of multiplication because of the base.
Yeah, so that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it turns out that the arithmetic operations that we thought kind of were almost like given, like universal, also depend on something as simple as the base that we may also think that is kind of fundamental. So the base basically is telling you what kind of mathematical methods you adopt to do basic arithmetic.
That's cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, like this kind of stuff just never stops having exciting mysteries. So also like before I ask the last question from Slido, I'm curious. Well, I know the answer, but I'm gonna ask like I don't know the answer because I think the audience will enjoy this. Is there if I were to do some of these estimations and I'm doing some like experiment and doing some coding and I really wanted to implement some of like these measures like BDM, for example, is there like a software library that I can use to find these approximate semi-computable bounds?
Yeah, in some of our lab web pages, we have a library of implementations of CTM and BDM in different programming languages. It's actually a library in R, so you can just invoke it, and it has been there for years now. There's also PyBDM, which is written in Python. So there was a community that came up with all these small pieces of software to calculate it. And we also have a complexity calculator online, which has some limitations because it is a web page, so you cannot do like large calculations, but you can play with it. We lost one of the domains, but now I think if you add the hyphen between complexity and calculator.com, I think you get to it. So it is either with hyphen or not hyphen. We are trying to recover the other domain. But yeah, absolutely. And you can also download the raw data and basically do the calculations yourself. And it is two algorithms, different algorithms. So CTM is the one that gives you the approximation of the short computer program. And actually, it is a set of computer programs that explain a piece of data. And then BDM combines algorithmic complexity with Shannon entropy. Because obviously, we also want to use the best of what a Shannon entropy gives you. So by combining, basically, we are solving the problem where you don't have to go back to Shannon entropy. You can just use this one.
Yeah, true. They're super useful for anybody who wants to use them. That's like fantastic. Okay, so we're gonna lose. Oh, we have well. Okay, so we're gonna do one more question for the Slido, and then we're gonna continue the discussion in a Google Meet room, which we will post in the chat. So we'll share it with people so people can jump over, and then we'll continue talking. So if I didn't get to your question, I'm really sorry. But you can still answer. You can still have your question answered, and with lots of discussion if you want to join us. So the last question is from Christoph, and he asks, "What kind of compression, in your view, do LLMs perform? Are they algorithmic compression, statistical, both, neither?"
That is a fascinating question. So there's a lot of discussion, and there's some people that LLMs are kind of statistical parrots, which I think they are right in some way, but I think they are also inferring some sort of rule-based knowledge that is algorithmic. And I think it's a combination of both, and basically improving LLMs means that we have to go through the path of trying to make it more algorithmic than only statistic, because that's precisely the current problem with things like hallucinations, for example. And some of you, by the way, may know that I wrote some functions for C and Alexa, and they are now used to deal with hallucinations in ChatGPT. And it is a fascinating idea. And the problem is that we tend to think that LLMs should think like humans, but when they are hallucinating, it's only because they are providing the most likely statistical answer. And it doesn't matter whether it is factual or not. But we can solve some of those hallucinations by making it constructible. In other means, it shouldn't be produced just by statistical likelihood, but also by algorithmic likelihood. And that's very different. An example that I use is Borges' infinite library. You may remember the analogy where you have basically every permutation of letters producing all possible books in an infinite library. So in that library, if you go to that library and pick any book, most likely you would look only like garbage. There's no sense. But if you had some sort of you had what I'm going to call Chaitin's library. So instead of having every permutation of letters, you have every possible program producing all possible outputs. What you would have is also a lot of garbage when you open a book, but at least you know that comes from a computer program, and that's completely different. It is a subset of constructive books and configurations, and that has some advantages. So you will reduce the number of hallucinations by doing so. And then you can keep constraining the space, and that's basically what we are trying to do with LLMs. So it is very interesting and fascinating. I think the whole deep learning started with using only statistical means. So Shannon entropy is key there. For example, when you evaluate the distance function between ground truth and your own predictions, you always use this kind of Shannon entropy-based distances, and that is a potential problem. So if we want to get into more interesting, powerful, deep learning methods, that's exactly what is happening with transformers. Transformers are kind of compressing the layer space, and to compress it, you have to pick the right signals, and sometimes doesn't have to be only statistical ones, and especially the algorithmic ones are the ones that give you the greatest advantage.
That makes, yeah, that's really cool. And it sounds like there's a lot of potential there, especially with, of course, the big boom in LLMs and transformer models.
Yeah, we have another paper in Frontiers of Artificial Intelligence where we are trying to combine algorithmic complexity and deep learning, some methods. What we found, for example, it was that back then, I don't know if you remember this idea of differential programming. It was thought to be fundamental, that the search space had to be differentiable. And now nobody is talking about it because actually we found that it is not like a fundamental feature of deep learning when most people thought it wasn't. Now we are starting to see more discrete systems, and our paper, for example, is trying to combine those kind of ideas.
That's great. Oh, okay. Well, that's awesome, and I always encourage everybody to go read Hector's papers. There's some great information on his website, his personal website, and of course you can catch all of his recent things on Google Scholar as well. So unfortunately, we will have to end the live session here, but we will continue the discussion in the link that is provided in the YouTube chat right here. So thank you all so much for joining us here on YouTube, and thank you so much for joining us today, Hector. This was an absolute blast, and can't wait to continue the discussion in the other chat.
Thank you, Alisa.
Great. All right, so we're going to sign off here on YouTube, and we will see you in the other room if you're going to join us for the discussion. Bye-bye.